Hello, and thank you for joining Nova Roma's Twitch account. This is Decimus Claudius, and I am very pleased to have another interview today. Before I do, let me just say thank you to Cornelius Lentulus for for setting this up. And I also want to say that this is part of the Ludi Serialis, which is going on in Nova Roma right now. Anyways, today's guest is a Nova Roma citizen um, by the name of Gaius Caristanius Theodorus. However, he's a retired professor and he's also known by Christopher Stanley in the world. Um, and we will be speaking for about 2 hours on many topics. And I am very, very glad for him to be on today. Thank you so much for coming on. And I would like to first ask about, how you became interested in ancient Roman history.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Decimus, and thank you also for Lentulus for getting things together and putting us together. It's been really interesting to find out how many places you've been and places you've seen. It's really thrilling to see someone who is in another field unrelated to this, but just has such a love for Roman history. My own background actually was rather roundabout. I was actually a finance major in university and worked in business for a number of years. And, I had a smattering of interest in history, but I knew nothing whatsoever about the Roman world. But I've been, I'm a Christian, and I became interested in more the historical background of early Christianity, and went to do a master's program in Christian studies at a school in Vancouver called Regent College, and began to learn something more about the social and historical world of the New Testament. But even after coming out from there, it was not really until a few years later, went to Duke University and did my PhD in religion with minors in Jewish studies and classics, that I really began to get some into the Roman world. Had a very interesting class there where with one of the world's leading papyrologists, where we were spending the entire semester working on one papyrus text from the ancient world, each of us with a different one, and reporting back to the class. And had a class over at University of North Carolina in Roman law and a few other things like that. But still, my primary interest was textual, more so than the kind of social realia that I've gotten into in more recent years. And in my dissertation, I worked on issues of how the Apostle Paul in the New Testament handles the wording of quotations. But I compared this, among other things, with how Greek and Roman authors handled quotations from Homer. And so I was, slowly getting myself into that kind of comparative material. And in the books and articles I've written and edited over the years, I've moved increasingly toward more social history, sociological and anthropological approaches to both religion in the modern world and religion in the ancient world. And so my avenue into the Roman world has been more through the lens of the religious world, the religious history of Greek and Roman religion, Judaism, Christianity, indigenous religion. And a lot of that comes out in my novels that we're going to be talking about. But in the course of doing that, once you start, it's like pulling a thread on a sweater. You start getting into one aspect and another of the social world, and you start learning about things like the patronage system and the way a city worked, and variety of things like that. And it's like one question leads to another. And then when it comes down to actually trying to describe this in fiction, you start discovering all the picky little things you never thought about and having to dig in and get even more immersed in the details of daily life. My focus for the last many years has been not on the big historical characters and events, but the lived realities of ordinary people, social history. And most recently, and I'll kind of wrap this up with this, I've just submitted to the publisher a couple of months ago, be coming out in September, a fairly extensive treatment of sickness and healing in the ancient world, and talking about the lived experiences of how people, what kinds of sicknesses and injuries people experienced and how they treated them, a combination of home remedies and things that we might call medicine, miracle, and magic. And all this is background for talking about some things in early Christianity relating to that. And so I've really increasingly immersed myself in the details of the ordinary people in the provinces, as opposed to probably what people know more about, which is the big historical figures and the city of Rome and that kind of thing. I don't claim to be an expert on Rome itself, or on Rome, even on if you try to give me a test on the events of Roman history, I might fail. But if you want to learn, if you talk to me about how did people actually live and how life was so different in many ways back then than from today, that's really where I focus my attention.
And so a few years ago, you published several books, and I'm wondering, are novels something that you want to be published for a long time? Or did you publish just because I know that you published some nonfiction books, but did you just have a spur of the moment idea for a novel, even though you've published other things in the past?
I never imagined writing fiction. Just never even crossed my mind until one day, 10, 15 years ago, my wife just totally out of the blue said, all this historical stuff you ought to do, you ought to think about writing a historical novel. And we both love historical fiction. We read or listen to a lot of historical fiction. And the thought had never crossed my mind. And my immediate reaction was, I don't know anything about writing fiction. I'm a very good writer. I know I'm a good writer. I always have been. I had very good writing education coming up. And, I'm complimented all the time for my academic prose actually being comprehensible and clear. And, but the idea of writing as a creative process to tell a story was not something I had really done. And so I told her, I don't know how to do this. And then, much to my surprise, that maybe the next day, this wonderful opening scene of a book just came into my mind, and kind of thought it through. And it actually is the prologue in my first novel. And over the next 2 weeks, this book just wrote itself. I kept telling my wife, and this happens, and that happens, and the other thing happens. And she just, she's often my worst critic, and she was very encouraging, like, hey, that sounds good. And so I had it kind of floating around in the back of my mind. And then, a few months later, maybe a year later, I was in Ireland for a semester on a Fulbright fellowship. And I went over to England and Scotland, speaking at a number of the major universities there, as part of my Fulbright process there. And I was out hiking on some beautiful countryside on a hill ridge in England, kind of central England, and had not even thought about this novel. And I'm walking along, and just this opening prologue scene starts kind of coming to my mind word for word of how to put it together. And I was literally walking along hiking and memorizing what turned into 2 or 3 pages of text, and went back to my hotel room, typed it up, sent it to my wife. And she said, you can write fiction. So this is as good as most of the stuff I've read. And so from there, it was just a slow process. I had my own academic writing and teaching to do. And so it took several years to write what ended up being about a 1,000-page novel, which turned out to be a bit too big to market for publication. So I ended up dividing it into 2 books. And so the first 2 turns into, there's a trilogy, so there will be a 3rd book. So the first 2 books are here, A Rooster for Asclepius, and then A Bull for Pluto. And the third book will be called A Ram for Mars. These two are, yeah, they're on Amazon, they're on Kobo, they're on Apple Books, Google Books, a lot of places you can buy them. But the easiest way to find them is I have a website we were going to mention that's got a lot of information relating to the books, and there are links there to all the purchase sites. You can read reviews. The URL is simply, I call it the A Slave's Story Trilogy. And so the website is A Slave's Story, all run together without an apostrophe for slave, between slave and S. So aslavesstory.com. So if people are interested in checking out the books, learning more about them, seeing some fellow scholarly comments about them, I've gotten wonderful, wonderful reviews from people who actually know the world of Roman Asia Minor and have said how these books really, even though they've been there many times, they just never thought about it this way, really making the world come alive for them and things like that.
Yeah, and I checked out the first one on Amazon. I believe it had 30 reviews on Amazon, and they were very positive. And I've read a good portion of the first one, and ironically enough, I was in Turkey until a few days ago, and
Right.
I was in some of the exact places where the novel took place. So it's very nice how that kind of came together.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so what are maybe you could speak a little bit um, about the first book, about the setting, and also your experiences in Turkey that led up to um, you wanting to set the story in that location.
Yeah. Let me start with a kind of a summary of the plot line, because that will help to make sense of why these different places matter. The story basically is about a master and a slave, and the slave is the main character, but really the two of them are kind of hand in hand. The slave is a youngish guy, the master is an older guy. And the slave is essentially the office worker, the bookkeeper, accountant, kind of like the like Tiro was to Cicero, a slave, but a slave who is educated and trusted and kind of very close assistant to the master.
And another
And
example would be in the Rome HBO series. I believe his name is Poscus and
okay,
and Caesar.
okay, I didn't remember that. It's been years since I watched that. Yeah. So, I mean, right off the bat, one of the things I try to do is to show that slavery in the Roman world was nothing like what we know in the American South. I mean, some aspects of it were, but well, we can come back and talk about slavery later if we want to. So basically, I have a lot at the beginning, kind of immersed into the world of Pisidian Antioch in central Asia Minor. It's the modern Turkish town of Yalvaç. The ruins there are there's not a lot of ruins there, but we could talk later about why it's set there if you like. The beginning of the book, the master has already got some kind of an unknown abdominal ailment that plays a central role in the story. And I don't shy away from describing the grossness of an abdominal ailment and the kinds of things that can bring about. But he ends up pursuing all the medical type of help that he can, and some kind of magical type things as well, and ends up heading west to the temple of a sanctuary of Asclepius at Pergamon in response to a dream from the god. And so this kind of central part of the book is a kind of a travel log, if you will, as he goes west from Pisidian Antioch to Apamea to Ephesus to the Oracle of Apollo at Claros, north of Ephesus, on up to Pergamon. And probably the last quarter of the third of the book is set at the Asclepion, the temple of Asclepius in Pergamon, or in the city of Pergamon itself. And then in the second book is the journey home with a long stop in Hierapolis, Pamukkale, where you just were recently, and then back to Antioch and the aftermath of his journey. And I won't be giving too much away to say that the journey does not go well. But a lot of surprises are revealed along the way. It's one of those books where it's gradually things develop in such a way that a lot of personal tensions arise and relational issues come up and anxieties about the future and a host of things along those lines. So in relation to the places, when I was, I honestly don't remember how exactly I ended up with Pisidian Antioch, but when I had the general framework of how this route would go and the general narrative, I actually, I had been to Turkey before, but I had a friend who is a scholar who of early Christianity who lives much of the year in Turkey. He trains Turkish tour guides. And so I paid him to travel around with me for about 10 days, visiting all these sites, and we were kind of exploring them together and getting the benefit of his expertise. And it was really through this traveling around with him to the various sites that came to be incorporated into the book that I became much more aware of the healing side, the religious healing shrines and things like this. And really that came to play a more prominent role in the stories as a result of my hands-on experience of traveling the same route that my characters end up traveling. So when I'm describing sites in the book, I'm either drawing on my own, I'm drawing on my own experience and every extensive study of each site in terms of the archaeological reports and Google Maps, Google Earth, looking at the site, and some of the places I hadn't been exactly because the modern road doesn't go exactly where the route would have gone in the ancient world. But I was so persnickety about getting the Roman route right and describing the terrain correctly, and even as much as possible when things are taking place and you're entering the city, you're traveling through it in the novel, you're at least using a combination of what we do know from archaeological excavation and my general knowledge of Greek cities, Roman cities, and using informed imagination to reconstruct the sites.
Very fascinating. I mean, because when you go to Turkey, obviously, there's so many sites. It's pretty, I wouldn't say everywhere, but pretty much if you're driving along to most main roads every 20, 30 minutes at the most, you could come up with a site.
I tell people there are better Greek and Roman ruins in Turkey than there are in Italy and Greece.
I don't know about that. I mean,
I think so.
I don't have favorites in that sort of respect. But one thing that we also spoke about briefly in the past was you wrote a section in the Asclepion in Pergamon, and that was a very interesting place where I visited. Unfortunately, it was in the rain, even though pretty much the trip was sunny and bright. But you mentioned that you had to do research into how the Asclepion in Pergamon looked like.
Right.
When the book took place, because obviously when you go now, there's different buildings, things change. Just like in Rome, I mean, if you go back in time to when, various emperors lived, you might not see the Colosseum or things that are really, really famous today, because obviously, things evolve over time and some buildings collapse or some things are better preserved, some things are less preserved. So sometimes when you go to the ruins today, you don't get you get a little taste of the past, but you don't really get, obviously, the whole scope of the city.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. When I was, I had been to the Asclepion. I knew that much of what you see there today that's fairly impressive is 2nd century. Hadrian did a massive reconstruction of the site. And so it resulted in a substantial reconfiguration of how the site was set up and how it worked. And I had vague knowledge that there had changed, but I really didn't know how. And I thought, I'm not going to have people going In my novels take place in mid first century AD or CE, and not going to have them go to a second century place when they're in the first century. And it turned out to be amazingly difficult to find information. And the primary reason is that the second century reconstructions either obliterated or buried a lot of what had been there previously. And I was gradually being able to get information. But what I ended up having to do was I ordered in through the interlibrary loan of my university these 4 gigantic volumes of the German archaeological reports in German. And in the back, they had these pages and pages of color-coded diagrams that were almost as confusing as the archaeological site. And I was just spent hours working through these diagrams in the back, and okay, this wall was here and this building was here, and here's, you know, where the temples and this kind of thing, in order to develop a kind of mental and physical picture of what the site was actually like in that time. And so then when I narrate my characters going on at a festival of Asclepius, going on the journey from the city of Pergamon up on the hill, down through the valley on the sacred way into the site of the Asclepian, you know, I'm describing it as much as can be reconstructed, what it was like in that time. I still had to use my imagination in a couple of things. There's no knowledge at this point about where the baths were there. And I put them in as at least a historically plausible place. And the theater that is there is second century, but there is at least some indication there could have been a first century Greek theater, a Greek theater there in the first century, and it worked for my purposes to have one there. So I took a little license here or there without archaeological warrant when I had to in telling a story. But insofar as possible in all of my narratives, I stuck with what we actually know on the ground. And as much as possible, as I said earlier, try to replicate the actual social customs and practices and values and even modes of speaking. We all obviously, ancient ordinary people didn't leave writings to go by. And, you know, what do we use? The best thing I could find to at least try to approximate how people spoke at the time was in the plays of Plautus and Terence, a few others like that. And even there, you're getting ordinary people's speech filtered through the lens of elite writers. But at least you get some inkling, particularly of Plautus, because his plays are all about kind of ordinary people. And so while I didn't try to mimic Roman language patterns, I mean, and I didn't try to copy Plautus, you know, I appropriated expressions and modes, kind of broadly modes of speaking from those windows of how people might have spoken back in those days. So again, trying to replicate as much as possible what we can know about life in the provinces among ordinary people at this time.
Now, I do have one question, and it's about the Asclepion, but not just in Pergamon. I know that there were 3 very famous Asclepions. Actually, I don't know the plural of Asclepion, but in
Asclepia.
So in Pergamon, in Epidaurus, and in Kos.
Right.
Why were these 3 singled out in antiquity, especially because there were hundreds of others? And why would rich people pay a lot of money to go there specifically?
Yeah, great question. And I don't know that we know the answer to that. One of the fascinating things that I was addressing in this academic book that's going to be coming out, it's from Bloomsbury. It'll be coming out. It's called Paul and Asclepius, the Greco-Roman Quest for Healing and the Apostolic Mission. And one of the things that I was highlighting in there is that in our modern world, we just kind of assume that people go to doctors and that knowing that there were physicians in the ancient world, as they were, kind of assumed that people went to physicians as their first line of treatment. And that's simply not true. And in fact, historically, and coming back to your question, both the healing, the pattern of honoring Asclepius as a healing deity and medicine began at the same place in Kos, island off the southwestern coast of Turkey. That's where Hippocrates was from. And there was this close interplay of what we would think of as religion and medicine in the Asclepian sanctuaries. And over time, they continued to influence each other. So what we think of as medicine included elements of religion and what we might label magical practices. And what we know of as religion included elements of medical practice. And Asclepius over time ends up being essentially to some degree medicalized. And so the kinds of treatments he prescribes are like what physicians would do. And so there's this, as to why Epidaurus, why Pergamon, if I had to guess, and I don't know the answer, Epidaurus was at least close enough to Athens. Athens had its own Asclepian, but they had this massive theater there. It just kind of developed as a complex in a rural area. And Pergamon, I think, had a lot to do with the sponsorship of the Pergamene rulers from the time that they took over there, and they like to kind of have their own things in their own territory.
Yeah, actually, we have a comment in the live stream. They were also significant Asclepion in Athens and Corinth that person knows of. So yeah,
there are literally hundreds of temples of Asclepius around the ancient world.
And can you just briefly describe, for instance, what happens when, let's say, either in the book or just generally speaking, what happens when you come to an Asclepion? Because there's a lot of different things that happen there, and it's not just a temple, and it's not just a hospital. It's more of it's also like a community center in a way. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to it.
Like a health spa. One of the fascinating things, we actually know a fair amount about Asclepius and Asclepia in general, because when people either came for treatment or more often when they were healed, they would leave behind physical evidence, either in the form of carved images of the body part that had been healed or of which they were seeking heal, votive offerings, usually in the form of clay carvings of an ear, an eyes, breasts, genitals, whatever it is, with or without some kind of little inscription with it, or columns, stelae, or there are inscribed tablets that we have from Epidaurus. We know they were in other places as well. And so when you went to the temple of Asclepius, the walls were covered with these physical objects that were there to instill faith. They were like, hey, look what he did here. Look what he did here. Look what he did there. And then when you went to the major centers, you had the abaton, the sleeping chamber. The primary aim in coming to a sanctuary of Asclepius, one of these major healing centers, was to sleep in this special dormitory, if you will, called an abaton, seeking a dream in which ideally Asclepius and or his daughter Hygieia would appear to you and either perform a miraculous healing on the spot or give instructions for what kinds of treatments that the physicians who were there also at the Asclepian sanctuary should do. We have a wonderful descriptions of what this was like in the 2nd century AD in the book called The Sacred Tales of Aelius Aristides, who was a hypochondriac who spent a long time at the Asclepian there and narrated all kinds of things about dreams and visions and treatments. And and some of the crazy things that he says that the God told him to do. And sometimes the physicians would say, huh? I said, well, the God said so. This is what we got to do. So there's a whole host of things in terms of the rituals as well that were intended to instill faith. You have a sacred well that you go and do ritual cleansing and drink from it, and the water was perceived as having healing properties. There would be sacrifices to the god, hymns sung to the god. A couple, the Edelsteins, back many decades ago, collected in 2 volumes the inscriptions having to do with the Asclepia. And in fact, I'll grab a copy right here. This big fat volume here. If anybody wants to get into the primary evidence about Asclepius and the temples, anything to do with him, Ludwig and Emma Edelstein, and it's this big fat book. About 2/3 of it is text and commentary on various inscriptions, and then the last third of it or so is kind of a synthesis. There's no better place to know more, to learn more, get in the nitty-gritty of the Asclepian healing practices in temples and etc. than this book here. It's 2 volumes originally. It's now published in 1 volume.
The ex voto offerings. Can you just briefly describe how they were offered and some of the, more mundane or the more interesting formulas that were found on these offerings?
Well, most of them don't have a formula. It's just simply a carved image. And the best we can guess, these were something that seemed to have been mass produced. How exactly it worked, whether the priest kept a stock of these around and said, okay, you want some eyes? Here's some eyes. By the way, eyes across the ancient world, eyes are the most common body part that appear in the votive offerings. And there's a lot of other evidence that eye problems were chronic in the ancient world. And so just an interesting little tidbit there. But somehow, like at the Asclepian in Pergamon, if you were there, and so you got the sacred way coming into the sanctuary. You got columns there, and there were shops along there on either side where those columns are, and so it may well be. If I had to guess, I would guess they might have been sold there, just like, let's say, if you go to a Roman Catholic shrine of some type these days, pilgrimage site, there'll be a lot of shops selling lots of little Catholic knickknacks and rosaries and things like that. And then, how exactly it got handed over and all with the priest, there's a lot we don't know about those kind of things. But not many of them. Only wealthy people could have afforded to set up a stele, which does happen actually, I should mention in my book, in my novels, Asclepius is not the only healing deity. Most gods could be approached for healing. And I've got in Pisidian Antioch was originally a Greek city before becoming a Roman colony in the 1st century BC, when Augustus settled veterans there. Prior to the coming of the Romans, there's a local indigenous deity called Main Askainos, as the version at Pisidian Antioch. And he has a temple up on the mountain outside of town, and you would have read that part already. And I have them going out at the festival of Main and approaching the god and bringing up an inscribed stele or column, because he wants to be healed, and he has that erected in the courtyard. Later on in the 2nd book, there is encounter with the cave of Pluto in Hierapolis, and the healing issues there as well. There are several other places where I don't have it actually described, but where other gods could be approached for healing. So I start rambling a little bit and answering your questions, but I think the bottom line is our knowledge goes so far and no further.
Now, you mentioned that there are others as well. I mean, I actually have some Roman coins. I have a little collection, and I have some coins with the reverse of Salos,
Mhm.
and it also has a snake, just like Asclepion.
Yeah.
So, but to be honest, I'm not sure much about him, about
Right.
Salos. So, can you briefly, compare and contrast Salos with Asclepius?
Not really. The reason that what the Romans did, they did have Sallust, and I don't know a whole lot about Sallust. It wasn't a big important deity, but as you probably know, the Romans um, had many gods for many different things, even related to health. So every sickness or many sicknesses had a particular deity associated with them. And so the goddess of fever, the goddess of scabies, the goddess of this, that, and the other, or god or goddess. And Salus was one of, I think there were a number of other ancient Roman healing deities, but the Romans took over Asclepius in the 3rd century BC. I'm suddenly forgetting the date. 2nd century BC, I believe. But there was this story where there was a plague in Rome, and they finally opened the books of the Sibyl to consult about what they should do in one of their kind of emergency activities. And they come to understand that they are to go and bring Asclepius to Rome and they'll be healed. And so according to the story, they take a boat to Epidaurus, and they want to take the statue of Asclepius to Rome. Well, you can imagine the local priests aren't too happy about that, and the Romans have the power. And according to the legend of the story, a snake, this huge snake, and Asclepius was associated with snakes for reasons we could talk about later, actually came out and got on their boat. And they took that snake back to Rome and took it to the island of the Tiber, where the snake got out, swam to this island, and so they built the temple of Asclepius there. And voila, the plague was over fairly soon. And so they adopted him with a Latinized name of Aesculapius, simply a Latinized version of Asclepius. And they promoted and the worship of Asclepius. He essentially was indigenized into a Roman deity from that time forward. So I think at that point, Salus kind of takes a back seat. It'd be my understanding, but someone can certainly correct me in the feed there if they would like.
Sure. And so my last question about this topic is, did Christians and Jewish people also go to Asclepion? Because there's a major religious component, but also, there were doctors there. So
Right.
were the evidence of Jewish and Christians there as well?
That's a fascinating question you asked. That's something that I do explore in this academic book that's coming out. And, one might imagine, of course they didn't. This is worshiping a false god or something like that. And like you, as I bored into the evidence, I initially thought, of course they didn't. And the more I dug into it, I thought, no, we can't say that. Partly for the reason you just said, that is that these Asclepian sanctuary. Now, you've got to distinguish a moment between the local temple of Asclepius. Every city had its local temple, and you could go there for healing and to offer sacrifices like you would to any other god. Whether you could sleep if the temple was big, the temples of Asclepius tended to be small, interestingly, small and plain. Asclepius did not like wealth and display. And that's why the title of my first book is A Rooster for Asclepius, partly because it has to do with the last words of Socrates, but also because Asclepius preferred simple offerings and was accessible and was beloved across the Roman world for that reason. So anyway, the big sanctuaries, though, this where they had physicians and medical facilities and health spas, if you will. They had the baths. They had the music and performance. It was very much of a holistic healing kind of environment. And in those settings, you didn't have to necessarily participate in the cultic worship. But even then, you could imagine that Christians or Jews could say, well, these aren't really, not really a God anyway. If I have to go through this just in order to get treated as a precondition. And there certainly are many references in the first few centuries of Christianity where the church fathers are increasingly verbal against Asclepius. Why? Because people are going to the temple of Asclepius to get healed. Christians are. And there's evidence, I found a number of pieces of evidence of Jews actually visiting pagan temples. And one fascinating story of a Jew it was in Athens, no, it was in northern Greece, who actually built, let's see, what was it he built? Anyway, no, I guess he just erected a column in honor of having had a dream in which a different healing deity, Amphiaraus, had come to him in a dream and told him to erect this column in thankfulness for being healed. So there certainly are, there was not the purity of monotheism and drawing sharp lines in either community that we might think. And so I think, yes, at least some Christians and Jews probably did go to healing sanctuaries of Asclepius and other gods. Others probably frowned on them for doing so.
And Judaism plays a role in the book.
Very big role in the book, yeah.
And at the beginning, well, not at the very beginning, but in the, I don't know, the first quarter of the book or so, there's a meeting with the main protagonists in the book and also some people of the Jewish community.
Right.
Now, one question that I've had for a long time was about identity. So how Roman did the Jewish people feel? Which I'm sure it changed over time. And also on the broader picture, how Roman did the people in Asia Minor feel if they didn't have like grandparents from Rome or from Italy?
Yeah. Complicated questions. I'll try to give a simple answer. As today, the views of Jews, the views that Greeks and Romans had about Jews were very mixed. Is essentially you loved them or you hated them. On the one hand, there were philosophers who admired the monotheism of Judaism because it was consistent with their own highest thoughts about the divine. People who admired the family values and the devotion to family and to spouses that you found in Judaism and their upright moral lifestyles. But that tended to be outweighed by very negative views of Jews, partly because their customs were perceived as so weird, and partly because they were perceived as politically subversive in some ways, and even more so the later Christians. From the standpoint of, and one of the things that we today have a hard time, most people have a hard time wrapping their brains around, maybe not people in Nova Roma, is just how weird monotheism was. You stand on the steps of a temple in an archaeological site today, and you look over the city and you see ruins of temples, and you think, the whole of social life was framed around shared ideas and shared practices involving the gods and the social and political life of the civic institution. You've got your patron deity of the city, and everyone is expected to honor and participate in worship of that deity in order to receive benefits and protection and prosperity and these kind of things. Jews didn't do that. Christians didn't do that either. And so already they're perceived as somehow undermining the divine blessings on the city. And then the Jews some of them at least didn't participate in some of the public activities of the city because of that, anxiety about idolatry. Others did, and there's a lot of variation, particularly it depends on social class to some degree. And so they were perceived as antisocial. People thought they were just bizarre that they didn't like pork, which of course was a common thing that Greeks and Romans enjoyed when they could eat meat. They thought their practice of circumcision was barbaric. They thought they were lazy because they took a day off every week and didn't work, and just on, all kinds of horrible rumors that were told about Jews, much like the kind of medieval anti-Judaism that we find in Europe. And so there was this sense that the more elite Jews who wanted to fit into the Greek city would become more Hellenized and Romanized. The Romans didn't really try to make people into Romans, and they didn't really care that much even that people shared Roman identity out in the provinces. They wanted to be in control. They didn't want you causing trouble. But as you know, to be the mark of a good Roman was to know your Greek literature, to speak good Greek, and to be able to kind of embody Greek virtues, although obviously the things they rejected about Greeks as well. So, some Jews would have been very well integrated into Greek culture. We have Philo of Alexandria as the best embodiment of that. And others rejected everything about Greek culture that they could. And you have the Maccabean revolt in Judea in the 2nd century BC as a kind of an example of an extreme case of that.
And one thing that comes to mind is actually the destruction of the Jewish temple, because the best eyewitness we have to that is Josephus, who is actually Jewish. And I remember reading that book back in college as an undergrad, and we were told that Josephus, he went over to the Roman side not out of convictions, but just because he realized that Rome was stronger. So I mean, he understood the Romans, and he joined them like to an extent, even though at the beginning he was opposed to the Romans. And one thing I liked about Josephus, and I mean, people debate whether, for instance, the body counts in this battle or that are actually true, but it's just incredible details, such a wealth of knowledge that we gain from his specific work. However, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was a huge event for Jewish people, and there was also a lot of casualties of Roman soldiers, because it wasn't just the destruction of a temple. It was really putting down uprisings in different places.
Right.
So, and actually, I believe it was Hadrian, after putting down an uprising, was so pissed off with the Jews there that he actually banned them, and he consecrated it to make it a to Isla Capitolina, so a pagan city. But were these uprisings also contributing the fact that people were upset with the Jews, or were these uprisings more just seen as just localized, just in some far off country that doesn't matter?
Well, you got to read my third novel once it's written.
Well, of course.
The third book will actually be taking my slave character, who is eventually liberated, and I know, and in fact, I'll give away another little spoiler because it's going to be important to our conversation. He discovers near the end of the first book, and grapples with it in the second, that actually his mother had been Jewish and had been hidden from him. And so he's starting to grapple with his own Jewish identity. And is he going to accept this in a world where, as you would know, the first part of the book, there's a lot of anti-Judaism expressed in the first part of the book. And one of the major issues in the book is the master and the slave coming to a better understanding of Judaism and to a more accepting view, and perhaps even a positive view of Judaism. So there's but without giving, well, I'll just leave it at that. So the third book takes the slave to Israel, to Palestine, in the years leading up to and going through the Jewish revolt. And so I'm actually in about 3 weeks heading to Israel and Jordan to do some, I've been there several times, but I want to go there, do some more on-site research at sites that will appear in the third book that I've either not visited or haven't looked at with this in mind. So
which places are you going to go to specifically?
Excuse me?
So which places in Israel and in Jordan are you going to go to specifically?
Oh, well, it's two things going on here. So I have to nuance it. My wife, her cousin, and his wife are coming with us. So partly I'm taking them to sites related to Jesus, the Gospels, things like that. But the particular places that I'm going in relation to incorporation into my narrative, Sepphoris is going to play a role. Yodfat, the Jotapata back in Josephus' narrative, where he is besieged and claims to be the only survivor and ends up going over to the Romans there. The route of some of the battles in what is today the Yarkon National Park and Antipatris, both over near Tel Aviv, of course down to Jerusalem. We'll be going to Masada, though I'm not going to be narrating it. In fact, what I'll be narrating, I try to give, I'm giving a different perspective on everything than normal. And so in the third book, because my character has grown up in the Roman world and has positive views of Romans, he's going to be a pro-Roman Jew in the Jewish revolt there in Israel. And the awkwardness that raises when you got friends and family members on all sides of the question. So we'll be getting into the complexity of how Jews viewed the Romans. And coming back to your original question, then, some Jews were in bed with the Romans, particularly those at the top of society in Palestine. The poorer you were, the more anti-Roman you were likely to be. But that didn't really permeate into the diaspora, Asia Minor. You didn't have revolts against the Romans in Turkey, in sympathy with what you had in Palestine. It's very much a localized phenomenon there. In fact, I left out one important point earlier about Judaism. One of the things that really complicated matters for Jews in the Roman world, is the Romans actually stood up for the Jews. We have a number of, in Josephus, these edicts that were issued by Roman officials in the 2nd century, 1st century BC, where local Greek cities were trying to repress the Jews, trying to make them come into court on the Sabbath. That was another thing. They kind of withdrew from social life on the Sabbath. Wanted them to come to court on the Sabbath, serve in the military, various other things they wouldn't do. And so they didn't want to give them permission to do things. This comes out in my books as well. And so the Jews would appeal to the Roman officials, and they would issue an edict actually saying, leave the Jews alone, because the Romans respected the Judaism because it was a venerable religion, had an ancient history, and they liked things that had been around a long time. And so you actually have this kind of odd complexity that's thrown in there, that the Romans are actually perceived in the diaspora as being on the side of the Jews, whereas in Palestine, they're perceived as the oppressors.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe that some of those edicts passed before the Jewish War were actually not very friendly, because I believe it was Caligula wanted to have a statue to him.
Well, that's in Palestine. Yeah, that was in
Palestine.
Right.
But due to the uproar, that was revoked. So it wasn't always just due to the goodness of their heart.
Yeah.
It was also just due to the political situation, in Jerusalem at the time, and what the Roman rulers could get away with and what they couldn't get away with. Obviously, this is before, especially before Hadrian's time.
Yeah. Well, the Romans had a security interest in Israel, Palestine, that they didn't have in these scattered communities of Jews around the rest of their world, because they had the Parthians had invaded from the east in the 1st century BC, and they had all these political machinations where the Parthians were involved and the Nabateans were involved on occasion. So they needed to keep the peace in Israel and dominate. You know, they didn't have anything against the Jewish religion. They were concerned about these people who were not wanting to pay their taxes and not wanting to have Roman presence among them, because this is Yahweh's land and there's no place for foreign rulers here. So certain kinds of Jews who felt like the Romans had no right to be here caused problems for them. So there was a security, peacekeeping, maintaining the eastern rim of the empire concern in Palestine that they didn't have in these scattered communities elsewhere.
Okay. And to go back to Turkey, I'm wondering, how did Asia Minor fit in to the Roman Empire? And I mean, I've been to various places in Turkey, and sometimes you'll see, for instance, if you go to, I believe, Lycia, you'll have certain sarcophagi that are a bit different than other provinces. But for the most part, at least the archaeological evidence which I've seen, is there's not much of a big difference in terms of items between the provinces in Western Turkey, but there is quite a difference between, let's say, Turkey, or Asia Minor is more correct, and let's say Greece or Rome. So, I mean, so where does identity fit into this? Is it more of a Asia Minor identity? Is it more of a Greek identity in a Roman world?
Yeah, it was complicated because Asia Minor, there are something like, I've forgotten the number, but something like 50 different little ethnic enclaves documented, people groups who had their own name and their own identity. And this changed over time. So before the Greeks and the Romans were ever there, the Greeks, of course, were on the west coast of Turkey very, very early on. But inland, you have Turkey is a fairly mountainous country. And so it's almost like you got a people in each valley, or in each mountain, or whatever the case may be, that because of geographical isolation, had their own languages, had their own customs, their own gods. A lot of these, we only know the names. They died out over time. They merged in over time with others. But some of the main ones continued, and particularly some of the indigenous deities and some of their practices. Above all, Maine, who I mentioned before, was worshipped the moon god was worshipped in temples across Asia Minor. And of course, above all, Cybele, and the great mother goddess, who was the dominant deity across Asia Minor. But she goes way back to the Hittites and others, all the way back to Çatalhöyük, where you got this feminine deity back in 2500 BC or something like that. We have the statue.
I just want to say that when I was in the Ephesus Museum, right before you see the large cult statues to Diana, there are actually a lot of these carvings to Cybele or Magna Mater that were found in caves. And right before you go into this, in this dark room set up kind of like a cave, there's also images of Cybele or Magna Mater over the civilizations. And sometimes it'll be 500 BC or 2500 BC.
Right.
And I actually took some pictures and I uploaded it to Nova Roma's Facebook page during the Ludi to Magna Mater. But can you speak a little bit about the I know that we're jumping, and I would like to revisit the identity question again. But can you speak a little bit to the history to Magna Mater and why that survived so many different civilizations and so many different rulers and conquerors, but yet it was that was one of the constants.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, one of the mistaken notions that I consider myself a feminist, but feminist scholarship sometimes has done some things that maybe don't end up holding up over time. And one of them was this idea in the early days of the feminist movement that religions were all religions or many religions. Religion was originally feminine, and everybody got along. And then you got these big male war deities that come in and mess everything up. Certainly, we do have an important place for female deities from Mother Earths around many cultures around the world, and was dominant in Asia Minor as well. But it seems that more often the feminine divine presence is associated with fertility, and not fertility just in the sexual sense, but fertility of the land, the animals. You put yourself back into an agricultural society, and fertility is survival. You've got to be able to have your crops to grow and your animals to have healthy children, and your children to survive in a world where where half the children died before age 5. Efforts to manipulate supernatural forces to bring fertility are a common concern of cultures around the world, back as far as we can trace human history. And that is usually associated in some sense with females, for the obvious reason that among humans, women are the ones who give birth, and they're the ones who are the nurturing of children, and in traditional cultures and things like that. So I think that it's not, to some degree, there's an actual continuity of deities. In fact, on my webpage, I have a blog tab where I post periodically about things to do with Roman social life, and particularly in relation to Asia Minor. And I've got a blog post there about deities, about the feminine deities in Asia Minor, kind of giving an overview. So we can trace a certain amount of continuity in the feminine deities, at least from, say, the Hittites or Proto-Hittites forward. So maybe 1,800 BC coming down. And Cybele does seem to be, and I use the Greek pronunciation rather than Cybele, but Cybele, Cybele, whatever. Romans eventually take over the name Magna Mater when they take her to Italy. But you can pretty well trace her presence for about 1,000 years, because the iconography is very similar. She's generally pictured as seated on a throne with 2 lions or leopards or something on either side, and with a kind of a battlement crown on her head. And you get these similar kinds of images even when the name changes. And so a common idea. And of course, as you know from having been to that Ephesus museum, we have Artemis. The picture of Artemis in the temple at Ephesus has nothing to do with traditional Greek deity Artemis. This is Cybele under another name, and she's got a lot of the same features. And interestingly, if you've been to Aphrodisias,
one of my favorite places in Turkey.
They've got a statue of Aphrodite. This is almost the same as the statue of Artemis in Ephesus. Both of them are really Cybele
sort of
in Greek form.
Stylistically, yes. The details are a bit different, because in Ephesus, you would see a lot of bees, but that also has to do with the city of Ephesus. And you also see a lot of bull's testicles, which are a bit amusing to see rows and rows of bull testicles.
Well, if that's what they are, who knows what it is? There's a lot of dispute on that, but
yeah, that's true. So I mean, when you see bees and you see bull's testicles, you think you think of fertility, I guess, because bees are very industrious. I don't think they have such a long life, but they're constantly working and procreating, and bulls,
they fertilize the crops.
Yeah, and bulls, well, I mean, they contribute to
they're the embodiment of male fertility in many cultures. Yeah.
The Aphrodite statue didn't have either of those, but they had other important,
structurally similar, being a kind of monolithic column with the crown and the vestments, and so at least in a large scale, it's definitely not Venus. This is not the Venus de Milo.
And actually, in the comments, Hortensia Faustina wrote that Magna Mater Idea saved Rome. Isn't that? isn't that a bit ironic? Because the Romans are so proud of themselves, but yet a foreign deity, and back then, I don't think it was quite a backwater, but Asia Minor was far away from Rome. I mean, significantly far away
Mhm.
from Rome.
Yeah,
And to have a foreign deity save Rome rather than a traditional Roman or Roman/Greek
yeah.
deity.
Yeah, my memory, if my memory serves me correctly, she was the first deity, non-Roman deity, to have a temple built in Rome. And it was exactly, similar situation with Asclepius, brought her in for healing. As the Romans moved outward and became more aware of other cultures, of course, we all know how they identified their own deities with the Greek deities, but they did the same thing with native deities. And so this made it wasn't so much bringing in a foreign deity as they would say, hey, that god or goddess over there, that's the same as ours, just in a different form. And this enabled them to embrace more and more deities within their system.
And Hortensia Faustina just added in the comments, it tied into Troy, which I actually forgot because the the foundational myth of Rome with Aeneas, um,
Mhm.
that like so yeah, he originated in Troy, and Troy is in Asia Minor. So I mean,
Right, right.
there is that connection,
Yeah, yeah.
and with the also they check the Sibylline books, and such as in a time of national emergency.
Right,
So I guess it was foreign, but not that foreign.
right. And again, as you know, the Romans never didn't really set out to take over Asia Minor. It was just kind of foisted on them when the Pergamene king died and willed his lands to the Romans. And then it's like, the camel gets his nose in the tent, and you got to go a little further and a little further. And next thing you know, you've got they're in charge of an accidental empire. I mean, in many ways, the Romans Empire was an accidental development over time. It was not a planned process.
It's actually interesting. In the Pamukkale museum, it's sometimes you read Pamukkale Museum because that's the Turkish name, or you see the Hierapolis because that's the ancient
Right,
name. They actually have a huge bust to the last king of Pergamon, who gave the area, I believe, in his will to the the Romans.
right,
Now sometimes you see, for instance, Hellenic kings, or kings in different um, places that have like or that the Romans did a Roman statue for, but not quite like this, because it
right.
was a huge bust, and you could tell that, like, so normally, not always, but many times the Roman conquered the place, so they wouldn't have a bust to the last conquered king. But since he gave it into his will, I guess he was more like celebrated, more of like a patron of the city, or kind of like, I don't know
Well,
if they would consider
Hierapolis was
savior,
part
but
Hierapolis was part of the Pergamene Empire. He was their king. So there's no real issue there. I mean, Pergamon controlled much of Western Asia Minor. So they had their own empire for a couple hundred years there.
yeah, but it's interesting because it's a larger than life size bust, and I
Yeah.
believe it's from the second century AD. So
Oh,
long
oh,
afterwards,
okay,
and it was
later.
carved by the Romans, and you could even see in the eyes, because they have like these little dips, that it's definitely later second century
Okay, yeah, I didn't remember
AD.
that.
Yeah. Very interesting, because like I said,
Yeah,
normally Romans conquered the area and they wouldn't celebrate the last king.
yeah,
So
yeah. Of course, but he's the one who gave it to them, so perhaps that has something to do with
yeah.
it.
Now, I remember reading in the book, and sometimes you have a lot of details in your first book, and you either put word in the narrator's mouth, or in different people's heads. And one of the things that you mentioned was about the necropolis outside of Pamukkale, and it's much larger than it would suggest for the city size due to the healing waters and
Right.
people going there. Now, is that something that you came across in your research, or is that another thing that you thought was plausible?
No, I think that's something I did come across. Is the number of tombs there is far exceeds anything that we would have from any comparable city size. I mean, way exceeds it. And of course, it was a health center. It was a health spa there. The heating waters, the hot springs, as you saw. I mean, it was a famous center that people came to from all around. So obviously, the fact you got so many tombs says it didn't work too well. That place, again, in my second novel, there's long chapters, several chapters take place there, where I try to bring that city alive, and the healing centers and the tombs there and all those things really take people immerse them into that world. Again, there too, you go to Hierapolis and you see the city map that they've got there. That's 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. So I had to go back and strip out some things from that as well.
Now, a big topic that we haven't really touched on yet is also Christianity. And one of the places in the book is Ephesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering why Ephesus was so important to early Christianity. Now, I do know about the journeys of Paul, but and Ephesus was the capital of Asia Minor at the time.
Right.
But so what is the significance of Ephesus, and why was it so important for the spread of Christianity rather than just taking a boat to Greece or to Italy?
I think partly you answered your own question. The cities that were politically dominant tended to become dominant also religiously. But I'm not sure even. I mean, would I accept your statement that Ephesus was so important for Christianity? It's, sometimes we have the happenstance of what has survived in terms of the literature and the archaeology. And, certainly Antioch in Syria was far more important. We think of Corinth being important because Paul wrote several letters to them, made several visits there. But in terms of just thinking off the top of my head, did the church at Corinth have a lot of influence? Well, the Romans knew about it. The Roman Christians, late 1st century, the author Clement was writing to the Corinthians, and he knew Paul's letters to the Corinthians. But yeah, I think we have to be careful about assuming that the sites that were mentioned in the New Testament or in the early Christian centuries once you get into the early Christian centuries, you kind of got more literature to see which places had a more influential role. But prior to that, just got to be careful. We have a very selective telling of the early Christian story in the book of Acts, and we have no clue how Christianity got to places like Alexandria, where it was important, over to Mesopotamia, all kinds of places like that. So I'm a little hesitant to say, the other thing about Ephesus, though, is such a trade center. You got people coming and going all the time, and where all roads lead to Rome, but in Asia Minor, they all go through Ephesus just about to get there.
And when I was in, I believe it was, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Laodicea on the Meander.
Yeah,
there is
today we'd say Laodicea, but Laodicea, yeah.
Okay. There is a huge Christian basilica, and I believe that was from Constantine, which is actually, it's amazing. I mean, I've been to a lot of early Christian churches, but a lot of them are after Constantine, and sometimes they're like 5th century, and you're like, well, it was just a little bit after the Roman Empire, but the churches could have probably been similar. But I mean, that was a really substantial, large church with high quality mosaics, I believe, and frescoes as well, because there's a section of frescoes, and that was during the that was built during Constantine.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what is the evolution of like the church or the meeting house? Because
Yeah.
I know that originally, people met out in the open or depending on the circumstances, sometimes privately in a home. But what was the evolution, and when could you walk by a church and realize either architecturally or symbolically that that is a meeting place for Christians?
Yeah. The earliest archaeological evidence is late second century. And so even then it's not very much. For the we from the New Testament we can know, and plenty of other references, that what we call Christianity was simply a group of people meeting together in the atrium or triclinium or whatever facilities were available in a wealthy house if they had enough room, or in a workshop in the case of a workman, or perhaps occasionally rented quarters. Christians tended to were primarily lower class, lacking resources, and they met wherever they could. And it was no liturgy, no structure, no pattern. And of course, they kept their noses down, kept their heads down, because they were such weird people from the standpoint of their neighbors that even when it's a long time before you get any kind of official persecution, but it was just a group of weirdos. As you probably know, some people thought they were cannibals because they eat somebody's bread and body and blood, and thought they had. In that second century, we got references to them dismissing the non-believers before they do their the Eucharist and all, and they figured they must be having sex orgies there. And do you really want your kids to join a bunch of sex-crazed cannibals who think the end of the world is coming soon? And this is kind of how people viewed Christianity in many cases. So they really were not meeting in any kind of fixed facilities, at least until sometime in the second century. And it's hard to know when and how that came to pass. And I don't know that I can answer your question. I'm not an expert. Once we get past first century, second century, my interest is far less, and therefore I haven't really pursued the evidence in that regard. Interestingly, though, you mentioned murals and mosaics. We see similar patterns in the Jewish synagogues in Palestine. 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, you find Jewish synagogues with zodiac mosaics in their floors in Palestine. And even you find Jewish houses with mosaics on their floors with Dionysus and other Greek and Roman gods. They had kind of come to terms with this, or they just saw them as decorative, look pretty. This is a thing you do to kind of be Greek, to be Roman, or whatever the case may be. So it's kind of around the same time Jews and Christians are doing the same thing. I should mention, for the sake of the audience listening in, Christianity appears now and then in the books, but very little. I intentionally did that because even though my scholarly focus is on early Christianity, I wanted to have a representative place of Christians, which is not much. And when you do encounter them, a lot of it is through the eyes of people who have negative views of them. And so I wanted to give a sense of just the strangeness of this group. But I tried to give, some positive representations as well, but it doesn't appear very often.
Tiberius Julius Nerva wrote in the chat, do you think that Christianity has gained popularity in society? So this is back in the ancient times, mainly due to its emphasis on the social question. I'm not sure about the social question wording that he mentioned, but is it more of like an emphasis on society and also social values rather than just a performative religion?
Yeah, it depends on what period we're talking about. 2nd century, 3rd century, there are Roman sources that testify to these Christians. They not only care for their own poor and needy, they care for ours too. And so there was something that might be what she's referring to, the kind of generosity of Christians, taking care of the sick, taking care of the poor. This was something that really impressed many people. To some degree, during that later period, also, their courage in standing up against opposition, in the arena and that kind of thing, and their boldness with which they would be willing to die for their faith was something that made a difference. But back in the earliest time, those weren't really the case. Interestingly, and again, I deal with this in this academic book that's coming out. If we look at Paul, who is our best window onto the kind of evangelistic ministry of early Christianity. And again, there's much we don't know about that. Well, Paul and the book of Acts. And they really portray that some of it has to do with persuasive speech, but a lot of it seems to have to do with the presence of the supernatural, however we explain that. Paul talks about signs and wonders accompanying his ministry. The book of Acts portrays miracles of healing and things like this. And in this academic book, I get into, well, how do we explain that? I talk about placebo effect and things like that. But there does seem to have been a perception, people were impressed by power, by divine power. Because ultimately, religion in the Greek and Roman world was not some, personal spiritual practices of somehow trying to find a calm spiritual state. I mean, it was about material prosperity. It was about, what do I need to do what do I owe to the gods because of what they have done in providing us with prosperity? What do I give to the gods to get prosperity? And prosperity defined as broadly as would it be national prosperity and success of the armies, or the successful childbirth of my wife, who is pregnant right now. And so this idea of whatever channels will enable you to tap into divine power, if Christianity offered that, it's going to be attractive.
Yeah, and I also remember that there were many different religions back then. Some and also other monotheistic, and there are also different types of Christianity as well. And there was a big, I don't know how you would say it, like competition for religious beliefs. And, sometimes they're mutually exclusive, sometimes not. If you take a look at Mithraism, it's perfectly acceptable to go to a Mithraeum and and believe in that and perform the rituals, but also go to the standard Roman temples.
Oh yeah,
And I mean,
everybody did that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the what they call the mystery, what we call mystery religions from the early 20th century, or they didn't have a term for them. We might say Eastern religions because they usually came from the eastern portion of the empire. But these little cults centering on a particular god or goddess were very popular around the time of the rise of early Christianity. And they often centered on they were not exclusive, but they would center on a particular god or goddess as one to whom, if you devoted yourself ritually and in other ways to this particular god or goddess, he or she would provide prosperity and protection for you in this life and enable you to escape, depending on how the framework, escape the starry watchers and demons in the sky who want to keep you here and allow you to be liberated into the realm of light and beyond, or whatever. I mean, lots of variety in these systems, but they were not generally exclusive. And some of them involved a dying and rising God. It had to do with more the fertility cycle and such as that. So to many people, Christianity would look kind of like a Jewish mystery religion. And that carried, for people who didn't like Judaism, that meant I'm not going to have anything to do with that. For those who might have thought Judaism was neutral or positive, then that might have made it more attractive to them. But it was one of many kinds of secretive little religions. We don't know a lot about the actual rituals of most of these groups because they were secretive, and they succeeded in keeping their rituals and initiation ceremonies secret.
And that's actually exactly what Tiberius Julius Nerva was saying. It was mainly for the elites, and there were a small number of believers. So, I mean, it really prevented it from expanding as much as other religions. And it's not exactly the same, but I've also been to, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Eleusis.
Yeah, Eleusis.
Yeah, and that was also, but that was probably it was a very famous, secretive.
Right.
I don't say, but it's not really a religion though. It was more of like, it was more about initiation rather than an actual religion. Would you agree with that?
Well, it depends on what you mean by religion. We can't define religion by our modern terms. I mean, religion in the ancient world wasn't about personal spirituality or something like that. Eleusis tended to be as much political and social and elite. It was a little different than these other kinds of groups that were more popular and often appealing to the lower classes. In fact, one of the things I left out earlier when the comment was asking about social, another aspect of early Christianity that made it attractive to some people and not to others was they were had radically countercultural values. As you know, in the Roman world, hierarchy was everything. And knowing your place in the pecking order, and you were constantly reminded from how people sat, where people sat at in a dinner gathering to the way people conducted themselves in all kind of public settings, where your place was in the pecking order. And this Christian movement comes along and says, we're all one. We're all equal. You don't bring your social hierarchies into this group. A slave is just as much, has just as much value, and not just in terms of God's eyes, but in terms of working within the group, as the rich dude over here. And so this has made it very attractive to people on the bottom, because they're not being constantly put down in their place. They're being told you're valuable. Women and slaves especially. And on the other hand, it's also why you had very few elite people joining, because they were essentially being asked to give up their positions of power and prestige, at least within this community, even if they continued to exercise them in their ordinary daily life and that kind of thing. I mean, Paul was not, the early Christians weren't radicals in the sense they were not advocating to get rid of slavery. They weren't saying, all the Roman world and Greek world ought to be socially leveled, economically leveled, because they believed the end was coming any moment anyway. And so God was going to obliterate all this stuff and, upset the apple cart, and those on the bottom were going to be on the top and vice versa. So they were not into social transformation, but their values, their practices within their group were radically countercultural.
Hortensia Faustina made a good point, and she wrote that Isis and Serapis worship were pretty popular, and so with the Romans, and there were issues with it that attracted lower classes.
Yeah, Isis and Serapis had a more universal appeal than Christianity did. It didn't have, one of the things about these other religions, they didn't place the kind of social lifestyle restrictions on people that Christianity and Judaism did, nor they were religiously exclusive. And Isis was appealing as again, the embodiment of the divine feminine. She survived the longest as a competitor to Christianity, she and Asclepius. In fact, in the 2nd century, Isis was perhaps the most popular deity in the Greek world at any rate. And some of the early Christian iconography of Mary and Jesus was taken over from Isis and Horus. So very much a competition there. And so certainly, Serapis, for those who don't know, is essentially a made-up god. In some sense, you can say they're all made up. But when the Greeks took over Egypt, they essentially created Serapis as a way of having a deity that was both kind of portrayed as both indigenously Egyptian and Greek. And he actually gained popularity and became known as a healing deity and many other things as well.
And Hortensia Faustina also said that there was a connection with Isis and Horus and Madonna and the Child. I mean, there's similar
That's what I was saying, right?
iconography. And I've actually been to several museums, and for instance, like a terracotta, so statuette, and it's you don't know. I mean,
Right.
you kind of do know due to the dating, but you could say, wow, that could be either. It could be either or.
We Mary and Jesus.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we only have 25 minutes. It's such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Um, I did ask you to do two readings
Yeah.
from your book. The first reading that I would like you to do was to give the readers a bit of a taste of Asia Minor. To kind of give them a bit, of what to expect in the
Yeah.
location.
Yeah. I chose two passages from fairly early on in the book that have to do with very mundane things. I mean, they end up playing a little bit of an important role as the story goes on, but the book is full. Both books are full of these mundane moments of ordinary life. Within the household and within the city streets and things like this. And so I'll read a couple of pages from one of the initial encounters. It turns out to be something important later, but it's fairly ordinary description of a patron with clients coming to see him in the morning and a particular episode. By the way, I should mention, the first book is available on audible.com, and the second book will be in the next week or two. And I have a wonderful reader. He's a far better reader than I am and got different voices for each character. So if anyone is like I do, I mean, I hardly ever sit down and just read a book, but I've always got 2 or 3 books going at one time and in MP3 players and things like this. So if you prefer to listen, the first one is available and the second will be available soon. So one day in March, by the way, I should note, I do use modern terms for months. I use modern terms rather than Greek or Roman terms. Like I talk about the office rather than the tablinum, and I talk about a butler. I use terms that modern people could understand rather than trying to stop and explain a Greek or a Roman term. So if your ears are offended by some occasional terms like that, just know it's part of my trying to get across to ordinary readers. One day in March, when the winter snows had melted and the trees and fields were showing their first touches of green, a new face appeared among the horde of clients who visited Lucius's house. Lucius is the main patron, the wealthier character. Visited Lucius's house every morning to pay their compliments and request his assistance. Marcus, who is the slave, Marcus was unaware of the man's arrival, since he was seated at his small desk in Lucius's office, taking notes of his conversations and recording the various commitments that Lucius made to his clients and vice versa. It was the job of Hermas, the butler, to prioritize the mob that milled about in the atrium, not his. But when a new visitor entered and Hermas was unsure what to do with him, especially if he looked like he might be an aristocrat or the agent of one, he often consulted with Marcus about how to handle him, while Lucius was talking with one of his less important clients. As he led the next visitor behind the wooden partition into Lucius's office, Hermas signaled to Marcus to join him in the atrium. He pointed to a short man who was leaning with his eyes closed against one of the columns that ringed the shallow pool in the middle of the room. He was surrounded by a shaft of sunlight that was through the opening in the roof, and he appeared to be enjoying the warmth. Hermas showed Marcus a small bag of coins that the man had given him to secure his attention. After a few moments of whispered consultation, Marcus nodded to the butler and walked over to the man. "Greetings," said Marcus. "I'm Marcus, the personal secretary of Lucius Coelius Felix, the master of this house. I understand that you would like to see my master?" The man wore the anxious but friendly face of a slave in his mid-30s. He was attired in a spotless blue tunic and sturdy sandals, and wore a gold ring on each hand. His dark curly hair was neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaven, and Marcus's nose caught a hint of perfume. This was no ordinary man's servant. "Greetings," replied the man. "Actually, it's you I wanted to see. The butler tells me that you're the one who arranges meetings with your master outside of his usual reception hours. My master would like to stop by and see him at a convenient time." "Who is your master?" asked Marcus warily. "I've not seen you here before." Forgive me, replied the slave. I should have told you that from the start. My name is Gaius Curtius Theodorus. I'm sorry, my master is Gaius Curtius Theodorus, a visitor newly arrived in your city, and I'm Fortunatus, one of the managers of his affairs. We've come here from Ephesus, where my master is a merchant and the owner of substantial property. He would like to extend his business to your city, and he sent me to arrange a meeting with your master as the agoronamos to discuss how to manage such a move. He's newly installed in the agoronamos office as head of the markets. He will pay you well for your assistance. He held out a small bag of coins, but Marcus did not immediately reach out to take it, so he tucked it back into his belt. What kind of business is your master, Marcus? He imports luxury goods, spices, rare woods, that kind of thing, said Fortunatus. He's going to need a local partner to help watch over his business in Antioch, and he thought that your master might be interested. He's willing to offer generous terms to the right person, he added with a wink. He held out the bag of coins again, and this time Marcus took it. Marcus stared at the man for a moment. This was the first real business opportunity that had come to Lucius in his role as agoronamos, and he knew that he would want to hear about it. Wait here, he said, at last. I'll ask my master about it between clients. The master nodded and bowed slightly as Marcus turned to walk away. I could come to like this man, he thought. Marcus spoke with the butler for a moment, then returned unobtrusively to the office and took up his usual station behind and to the side of Lucius. He knew this client, the one Lucius is talking with at the moment, and after a few moments he could tell that he had not missed anything important. I think I understand your concern, said Lucius, cutting the man off in mid-sentence. I'll have Marcus look into the matter for you. Now, if you'll excuse me. The man stood, bowed obsequiously, pronounced a blessing upon his patron, and left. What a bore, said Lucius with a grimace. But he has his uses. He wants to borrow yet more money from me to get a creditor off his back. Find out from Linus how much he owes and let me know by tomorrow morning. I'll probably lend him what he wants, but I'd like to be sure where things stand first. I might have to cut him off if this keeps up. Marcus nodded. So how do things look out there? Inquired Lucius. Are there many more of them? I'm afraid so, answered Marcus. But I'd like to speak with you for a moment before your next client, if I may. Marcus described his conversation with Fortunatus and handed Lucius the bag of coins that the slave had given him. Lucius hefted it for a moment, then returned it to Marcus. This does sound like an interesting proposition, said Lucius when he was done. If he is who he says he is. What was his name again? I believe you said it was Gaius Curtius Theodorus, sir, replied Marcus. Curtius, echoed Lucius, wrinkling his brow. I've never heard of anyone by that name in Antioch. That's too bad. It would be nice to know something about his family before I decide whether to see him. Of course, it's possible he's a freedman. A lot of those merchants are. He paused and stared at the wall for a long moment. Marcus waited. Yes, Theodorus could be a slave name, he went on. By Jupiter, I hope not. I don't want to go into business with a freedman. Perhaps you or Linus could find out more for me. Linus is good at digging up personal information on potential borrowers. Anyway, and it goes on like that. So I'll stop there with that part.
I do thank you for that reading. We don't have that much time, but I would be amiss to not ask about slavery back then.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were different treatments for the slaves. I mean, obviously, there you have slaves being beaten or killed over trivial items,
Right.
but you also have slaves that were really respected and really contribute. I'm wondering, in your books, what is really the relationship between the slave and the master? I mean, but not just on in the aspect that the slave is capable in business, but I mean the slave goes above and beyond what you would typically think a slave would do, and
Right.
he kind of anticipates the needs of the master.
Right.
He tries to do everything in his power to lift up his master while not showing any ego. I mean, with and maybe it's revealed later on in the book, and I don't want to be don't want to have spoilers, but what is his motivation? I mean, like, why does he really give his 110% of making his master happy?
Yeah. I should say that I too try to give diversity of slaves as the books go on. So certainly we know there were people who were abused, and I do show some of that in my novels, both physically and sexually. And slaves were they were property, and I show him recognizing that at various times in the book. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to present an apology for slavery here. But one of the things that is so radically different about Roman slavery than what we know of say, the American South, is that given a society where there was no social safety net, it could often be better to be the slave of a wealthy person than to be a poor freed person. You had food, you had a roof over your head. If you were someone who was fortunate enough to be closely associated with the master and the family, whether as a pedagogue or as a nursemaid or a hairstylist or as a secretary and an accountant or whatever, you could get special favors. It was very common for slaves to be freed in the Roman Empire, and usually after they were done with childbirth age, men at least at age 30. And so you were wanting to be on your best behavior, not only to avoid punishment, but also in order to further your own cause. A slave in a position like Marcus's could make money, get bribes and tips. Slaves could go out and work on their own if their master allowed them to. Technically, the money that they owned remained the property of the master. And as you'd see in my novel, that ends up getting abused later on by my master's son. But it can be a basis for saving money to buy your own slavery. Some slaves of wealthy people became wealthy themselves. A slave could own property. A slave could own other slaves. And one of the tropes that you find in some of the Roman literature from the time is the boorish freedman, the slave who gets freed, and he's actually richer than these old line Romans. And they borrow money from him in order to, support their lavish lifestyles, but they look down on him and mock him, and such as that. So very different world. As odd as this sounds, slavery in the house of a wealthy person was one of the few opportunities for advancement for a poor person in Rome. That just sounds so odd to us, but it was a way that you could it wasn't that common, but it could happen.
Absolutely.
In fact, you mentioned Ephesus. When you're standing there facing the Library of Celsus, that big arch to the right was built by 2 imperial freedmen.
And so imperial freedmen actually play a huge role in the empire, partially because various emperors really, I guess, they didn't trust their advisors that much, because they could have, vested interests, or, maybe due to different relations, or even if your grandfather wronged my grandfather, that could carry over for generations. Whereas freedmen didn't have that kind of background and baggage, and they were also I think they were more considered loyal to the person, because the emperor raised them to that status, and only the emperor did, and the emperor could take it away at any time if the emperor thinks that he's abusing his power. So
it's actually a little more than that. A freedman owed legal obligations to his former master of service and respect and honor. It's not like you're free and go off and do your own thing. And so totally apart from being, actually Augustus ran the empire through imperial slaves, not just freedmen. A slave could be invested with massive power and resources if they were in the right position at the right time. Freedmen also, but you could still be a slave and have a lot of power over other people. But if you were freed, and this comes up in my book also, in my novels, you owed the former master retained a certain amount of power over the body and resources of the freedman. So it was a norm that Augustus's freedman, or the imperial freedman, also owed that obligation to the emperor.
Unfortunately, we only have about 10 minutes. So there's questions
Got
in
more
the chat.
questions?
There's
You got
questions
more
in the
questions?
chat that we're going to get to, but I do want to get to your second reading because I also asked you to prepare a reading
Right.
for like a religious ritual, so we could also get a little taste on that aspect of the
Okay.
novel.
I thought maybe you wanted to skip that, but sure, I'll do. I'll make it shorter than I was going to.
Sure.
This is a scene early on where Lucius and Marcus are going to the temple of Asclepius just to see if they can get some kind of, response there regarding his sickness. And I describe where the temple is located and various other things like that. They approach it, and there's a knot of people in front of it. And so I'll start here. Stepping to the front of the procession, there's Marcus and Lucius and a few slaves with offerings and things like this. Stepping to the front of the procession, Marcus motioned for the others to wait while he went ahead to appraise the situation. They're looking down the road. Perhaps a dozen people, this is early morning, perhaps a dozen people stood in line awaiting their turn to approach the altar. None were aristocrats, but that was to be expected. Nearly all the elite class were busy receiving clients or calling on their patrons at this time of morning. As he drew closer, Marcus could see that the priest was facing the temple with his arms extended in prayer, so they would have to wait until he was done. Marcus motioned to Hermas to edge the retinue closer so that Lucius could step directly up to the altar when the ritual was over. "Make way," called Marcus in a loud voice when the priest had chanted his final prayer. "Make way for Lucius Coelius Felix the Agoronamos. Make way." The choir repeated his call. The waiting petitioners backed away as Lucius and his company marched somberly toward the temple. Marcus stepped up to his master's side when the procession reached the altar. Hermas and the choir moved to the rear. "Lucius Coelius Felix, Agronomos of Colonia Caesarea Antiocheia, has come to pay tribute and honor to the mighty Savior Asclepius and to petition for his assistance," announced Marcus in his most official tone. "Asclepius welcomes his august guest," replied the priest, his voice formal but friendly. "Does he petition for himself or for someone else?" "For himself," replied Marcus. He recognized the old priest as the same man who had officiated when Lucius had come seeking healing for his wife last year. He knew that Lucius despised the man, but he also knew that his master was capable of veiling his feelings when the occasion demanded. Marcus stepped aside so that Lucius could approach the priest. He was happy to have an excuse to move away from the altar and escape the smoke that had begun to make his eyes water. Looking back at the priest, he noticed that his eyes were watering also. Serving at an altar was a lot like being a kitchen slave, he thought. Both jobs required people to ignore the discomforts that came with regular exposure to fire and smoke. Marcus wondered how they could stand it. Lucius pulled a corner of his toga over the top of his head as a gesture of respect for the god. The priest nodded, and the flute player began a slow, quavering tune. Lucius cleansed his hands in the bowl of purifying water that the priest held out to him. Then he turned to face Amica, one of the slaves. Lifting the rooster carefully from his arms, he handed it to the priest, who passed it off to a waiting slave. The bird remained quiet throughout the transfer. It appeared to have fallen asleep during the procession. That was a good sign, thought Marcus. A sacrificial animal had to go willingly to its death for the ritual to be effective. The rest of the ceremony followed the standard sacrificial litany. The priest turned and extended his hands toward the statue of Asclepius in the temple, then uttered a formulaic prayer extolling the god's virtues and urging him to accept Lucius's offering. While he was speaking, the slave slit the bird's throat, opened its breast, and removed its entrails for the priest to inspect. When the prayer was done, the priest fingered the entrails and nodded to indicate that the animal was acceptable to the god, then laid the vital organs onto the altar fire. The slaughterer handed the corpse to another slave, who carried it off to the side where the bodies of the offerings were butchered and cooked. Lucius then received the wine and incense from Selina and passed them to the priest, who added some of each to the fire. The ritual ended with the priest offering a final prayer to Asclepius, in which he commended Lucius to the deity and petitioned him to come to the assistance of his humble worshiper. When the priest had finished, Lucius turned to depart. Before he could leave the altar, however, the priest caught his toga and stopped him. He spoke softly to Lucius, but Marcus was close enough to hear what he said. "It's good to see you here again," the priest began. "I'm very sorry that we weren't able to help your wife. She was a good woman." Lucius's face remained stony as he smiled, etc. I have to stop there because we're out of time. But some of the rituals I get into, particularly at the Asclepian, I've got hymns and prayers verbatim, but I don't do that in that particular episode.
How did you do the research? I mean, for instance, for your specific prayers, like the wording for these Roman prayers,
Yeah.
and obviously you have different prayers, not only for different deities, but different prayers for different circumstances. I mean, so which books have you used, and like, how did you do all that research?
It'd be hard to say identify particular books because there's been so many things, and part of it is just my work over the years. But when it came to writing the novels, I had to ask exactly those questions. What did they actually do? You know, we picture a priest offering sacrifice on the altar in front of the temple, but what kind of motions did they do, and what did people physically do in the process? And we have some evidence of that in engraved. There are quite a few engraved images of sacrificial scenes. And there are descriptions of rituals and sacrifices in plays and other kind of narratives. But it's one of the questions you asked there is exactly something I dug and dug and dug, trying to find, well, what did they actually say? And the bottom line was, the answer I found was, nobody knows. And so now we do have, like I said, some of the hymns and prayers to in particular deities like Asclepius, but those aren't necessarily ones that would have been offered at the moment of a sacrifice going on. And so I had to use my imagination, building on the prayers and hymns that we have elsewhere, and craft something that seemed to fit with what I understood. The same thing in the opening scene of the book has to do with the ritual in front of the lares. At the lares and the penates in the household. And again, we know some of that, but other places I had to reconstruct based on general knowledge about Roman prayers and the ways they were structured and things like that.
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, I wish that, we could talk much more about this, or maybe we'll do a second one, down the road, because there's so many different themes and topics I would love to get into. We have a bunch of messages and questions in the chat.
Go ahead.
And another one from Tiberius Julius Nerva. It's a bit different from what we were talking about, but he would just like to know what your opinion is of the term Byzantine Empire, and do you accept it, or do you think it was still the Roman Empire? Or so what's your view on that? Which is, I do have to say, it's a very, I don't want to say controversial topic, but it's debated a lot, and especially on Facebook, you could get passionate arguments that go on and on and on.
Yeah. Now don't even have an opinion. That's later than the period of my interest, and I don't have. I mean, I understand the basic idea of the Christianization of the empire and the move from Rome to Constantinople and all those kind of things, but I don't think I could make an informed answer. So let's go to the next question.
The next question actually built off of that one.
Well, then let's go to the question after that. The Byzantine Empire is something that you probably know more about than I do.
Actually, not quite, because I'm of the impression, and I respect other people's opinions, that the Byzantine Empire is not the Roman Empire. I mean, there are different familiar aspects and lineage, but there was a break, and it was noticeable linguistically, religiously, artistically. Mm-hmm. So for me, the Byzantine Empire is a successor to a portion of the Roman Empire. Now, some people completely disagree. Some people say that the Roman Empire lasted from 753 AD to 14. I don't know, because some people say it's the fall of Constantinople, and other people say says it's the fall of the trip. I don't even know how to pronounce this like small place in Turkey, which fell
Okay.
after the Constantinople. But for me, I can't make that.
I don't have anything invested in that question.
Well, you have to say thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's so many other things I would like to get into with you. But thank you so much for agreeing to the interview and spending 2 hours with me. And also, it's very nice to speak with you in advance, just to get to know each other a little bit, because we haven't crossed paths before. And I've read a big portion of the first book. I really enjoy it, and I would definitely recommend it to others. And also, like you said, aslavestory.com has a lot of information about your background and the books and how to get them. So it's definitely something to check out. And I just want you to have the last word before we wrap up.
Well, I'll just thank you, and thank you to the listeners who participated along, whether they've stayed with us the whole time or not, and for people who listen to it later on YouTube. I might mention I have done several video interviews on a YouTube channel called Myth Vision, of which the first 3 had to do with these issues of sickness and healing and magic and medicine and miracle in the ancient world. And so if you go to, I don't know, if you just search for one word, Myth Vision, MYTHVISION, it'll get you there, and you search for my name, Christopher D. Stanley. If you want to explore some of those particular issues further, the first one has to do with kind of well, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, go check those out, and you might find those interesting as well.
Definitely.
Go to the website, go buy the books, listen to them, give me your feedback. You can contact me through the website. I would love to have feedback, further questions. I respond fairly immediately to those things as well. So,
and you're also on Facebook.
The conversation, huh?
And you're also on Facebook. Another
yeah. I don't post as often on my Facebook page, but I'm happy to engage with anyone one-on-one about anything that you care for. So don't hesitate to contact me through that contact page, and I can get you to my email address as well.
Great. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to finishing the first book and making my way on the second. And also later this year, the nonfiction book coming out. So I'm definitely going to be looking forward to that.
Oh, I just thought of one other thing I should mention. The first book is kind of slow developing. There's a lot more action and things in the second book. So stick with it.
Thank you so much. And
thank
you for everybody's contributions in the chat. Some of the things I could get to, some of them I couldn't, but it's been such a great time. I'm not sure who I'm going to interview next month. I'm going to be in a few places in the US, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is such a wonderful place in New York. And also I'm going to visit the Yale University, where they have a lot of items from Dura Europos in Syria. And that's going to be amazing. So we'll see what happens with my next interview. But anyways, I hope you have a great Sunday afternoon, actually, because it's 6 hours ahead.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.